Edmund Ghareeb is with us now. He's a specialist of Middle East affairs. You've written extensively about this. Let me ask you about going back to Owen's piece. We heard one of the individuals, one of the sound bites say, needs to send a strong message to Russia. Is this a strong message to Russia?
Well, it depends on what kind of a strike it is. It depends on what targets have been attacked by this move. So a great deal will depend on that. I don't think in the long term it will make, unless it's a major attack, and which maybe targets Russian as well as maybe some Iranian forces and assets on the ground. So that will make a big difference, because then we'll see that will, however, lead to an escalation of the conflict, and it could lead to a much more dangerous situation. So if it's a limited attack, that's one thing. However, if it's a much more diverse kind of attack that targets not only as of now, what we know, at least so far, that this has been an attack on one of the research and centers that are allegedly making chemical weapons, and if maybe targeting also some of the Syrian military units, especially the air defense forces. But beyond that, we'll have to wait and see what kind of an attack, because I think the kind of attack, the size of it will make a big difference, and that will affect how the Russians respond.
And that's a good question, because you really have to thread the needle here. Apparently, the U.S. president doesn't want to slap on the wrist, which is what he saw as last year, and yet you don't want to calibrate things to such a degree that suddenly you have this conflagration. That's pretty tough to pull off, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's very difficult, and that's why I wonder to what extent we have seen any kind of communication going on between the U.S. and the Russians, the U.S. military and the Russian military, as well as between the diplomats on both sides. Because the Russians have also made clear from their side that if their forces, their advisors, their officers in Syria were attacked, they're going to respond by shooting down the missiles, and also by attacking the source of the launches. So that's much more dangerous than if it was just attacking Syrian targets and the Syrians responding. Because if that was the case, that would be very limited, and then even if there were several attacks, several waves, then it would be limited. But if it goes beyond that, it becomes much more dangerous, and it could lead to a much more explosive situation that may draw in the Russians and maybe others as well.
Let me ask you about the U.S. and its strategy when it comes to Syria, because we heard this president speaking in Ohio, it was just last month, saying literally that he was going to have the troops out within 24 to 48 hours, which, you know, the Pentagon told him that was impossible. And now we have this. It seems to be kind of all over the board, doesn't it? Absolutely.
This raises a lot of questions. I mean, as you correctly pointed out, it was only a week, 2 weeks ago when twice we heard that the president was going to pull out from Syria. He's going to withdraw U.S. forces, that ISIS has been more or less destroyed. And then we heard the reaction in Washington from some people in the military, from people in Congress, media, who really criticized the president, said we have to stay there. But what's interesting now is that within a few days, and especially after this alleged attack, chemical attack in Syria, what we saw is that there appears to have been a reversal. The president, maybe with the support of some of his advisors who are much more hawkish, maybe his national security advisor, Bolton, his also maybe the designated Secretary of State, the head of the CIA, who adopt a much tougher stand, versus, interestingly enough, the military. Today, there were reports, which I'm sure you've...
Edmund, back to you. You just had a chance to watch her. She's talking about the horrific deaths of civilians. Clearly, if there's one thing we've seen during the Civil War is horrific deaths of civilians, children, women, not just chemical weapons. There's been cluster bombs and phosphorus bombs, and the list goes on and on. Schools have been hit. Hospitals have been hit. There's been unbelievable suffering. Let's talk about the war itself. What does this do for the Syrian war? Because it seemed as though, I've heard a lot of analysts, I'd like to get your thoughts on this, that Assad had kind of turned the corner on this thing. Does this embolden the rebels? Does it Does this lengthen the war? I mean, what kind of impact does it have?
Well, this is actually a very important point that you're raising, because the question that a number of Middle East analysts have been making recently is that it appears that this kind of action, the story about the chemical weapons, the developments that took place basically in the Raqqa and in Manbij area, where the U.S. was saying that it's going to keep its forces there. These are being interpreted as basically attempts to try to influence the events on the ground, particularly after the Syrian regime has been able to make progress. Syria today controls, at least the Syrian government, controls somewhere between 75 to 80% of the Syrian population. They have regained control of large areas of the countryside. In Douma, we saw people in eastern Ghouta, we saw people actually welcoming the Syrian army, and yet what we have been seeing as a result from the Western efforts and this issue of the chemical weapons was basically, perhaps there have been different interpretations. One of them is to make sure that Western forces, Western countries have a voice in the future of the negotiations over what's going to happen in Syria. They wanted to make sure that they are players and that they have a say in what's going to go on in the future, particularly after the Syrians, with the support of the Iranians, of Hezbollah, and of the Russians, have changed the political equation and the military equation on the ground.
We are awaiting a briefing at the Pentagon, and that should be getting underway in just moments. We're expecting them to talk to us about these precision strikes that are taking place as we speak. Apparently some are airstrikes, others from ships. We'll get much more detail on that coming up. Again, we've heard from Theresa May, the Prime Minister. She spoke just a short time ago. We also heard from the U.S. President, and Emmanuel Macron also talking about the French involvement earlier. I'll just read a little bit of his statement. He said, "I ordered French forces to intervene tonight as part of an international operation with the U.S., UK, directed against the clandestine chemical arsenal of the Syrian regime. Our response is limited to the Syrian regime's capacity to produce and use chemical weapons. We cannot tolerate the normalization of the use of chemical weapons, which is a direct threat to the security of the Syrian people and our collective security. France and its partners will resume their efforts and the UN to allow the formation of an international mechanism to establish responsibilities in use if chemical weapons and prevent impunity and any inclination by the Syrian regime to use chemical weapons again." So the decision coming this evening that the strikes would be underway. Of course, there was a great debate beforehand. Let's hear from the Pentagon. I believe the Defense Secretary, Jim Mattis, about to speak.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As the world knows, the Syrian people have suffered terribly under the prolonged brutality of the Assad regime. On April 7th, the regime decided to again defy the norms of civilized people, showing callous disregard for international law by using chemical weapons to murder women, children, and other innocents. We and our allies find these atrocities inexcusable. As our Commander-in-Chief, the President has the authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to use military force overseas to defend important United States national interests. The United States has vital national interests in averting a worsening catastrophe in Syria and specifically deterring the use and proliferation of chemical weapons. Last year, in response to a chemical weapons attack against civilians and to signal the regime to cease chemical weapons use, we targeted the military base from which the weapons were delivered. Earlier today, President Trump directed the U.S. military to conduct operations in consonance with our allies to destroy the Syrian regime's chemical weapons research, development, and production capability. Tonight, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States took decisive action to strike the Syrian chemical weapons infrastructure. Clearly, the Assad regime did not get the message.
That is Jim Mattis speaking. Did we get the audio back? All right, let's listen.
The 70 nations in the Defeat ISIS coalition remain committed to defeating ISIS in Syria. The strike tonight separately demonstrates international resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used on anyone under any circumstance in contravention of international law. I want to emphasize that these strikes are directed at the Syrian regime. In conducting these strikes, we have gone to great lengths to avoid civilian and foreign casualties. But it is a time for all civilized nations to urgently unite in ending the Syrian civil war by supporting the United Nations-backed Geneva peace process. In accordance with the Chemical Weapons Convention prohibiting the use of such weapons, we urge responsible nations to condemn the Assad regime and to join us in our firm resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used again. General Dunford will provide a military update.
Hey, good evening. I'm joined by our French attaché, Brigadier General Montague, and our British attaché, Air Vice Marshal Gavin Parker. Secretary Mattis has just outlined the policy and legal framework for tonight's strike in Syria. I'll address the strike from the military dimension. At 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, French, British, and U.S. forces struck targets in Syria in support of President Trump's objective to deter the future use of chemical weapons. Our forces were integrated throughout the planning and execution of the operation. The targets that were struck and destroyed were specifically associated with the Syrian regime's chemical weapons program. We also selected targets that would minimize the risk to innocent civilians. The first target was a scientific research center located in the greater Damascus area. This military facility was a Syrian center for the research, development, production, and testing of chemical and biological warfare technology. The second target was a chemical weapons storage facility west of Homs. We assessed that this was the primary location of Syrian sarin and precursor production equipment. The third target, which was in the vicinity of the second target, contained both a chemical weapons equipment storage facility and an important command post. U.S., British, and French naval and air forces were involved in the operation, and for reasons of operational security, I won't be more specific this evening. Before we take questions, I'd like to address how this evening's strike were qualitatively and quantitatively different than 2017. Last year, we conducted a unilateral strike on a single site. The focus was on the aircraft associated with the Syrian chemical weapons attack in April of 2017. This evening, we conducted strikes with two allies on multiple sites that will result in a long-term degradation of Syria's capability to research, develop, and employ chemical and biological weapons. Important infrastructure was destroyed, which will result in a setback for the Syrian regime. They will lose years of research and development data, specialized equipment, and expensive chemical weapons precursors. The strike was not only a strong message to the regime that their actions were inexcusable, but it also inflicted maximum damage without unnecessary risk to innocent civilians. And with that, the Secretary and I would be glad to take your questions.
That is General Joseph Dunford. He's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Earlier, we heard from Defense Secretary James Mattis talking about outlining the strikes that are underway. Scientific Research Center in Damascus, storage facility west of Homs, another chemical weapons storage center much in the same area. They say that they're degrading the chemical weapons infrastructure in Syria. Let's go back to our guest, Edmund. Let me get your thoughts on what they had to say. And also, it's worth noting, I was just looking at the timeline, and I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. September of 2013, the U.S. and Russia agreeing to eliminate chemical weapons in Syria. Also in September, just a couple days later, government allows the UN to destroy chemical weapons stocks. The process was complete by June of 2014. Apparently not.
Well, that's the belief, but we have to, what we have heard from the UN, from the Russians and from the Syrians, that the chemical weapons were destroyed. Now, perhaps, maybe there are some, we'll have to wait and see, because I think there is a need for proof, for evidence. And so far, actually, as of today, and yesterday, General Mattis was saying, we don't have evidence yet that chemical weapons were used, and we need to investigate. We also heard similar things in reference also to that attack from General Mattis on Shuairat, which is basically the base, the air base that allegedly the Syrian airplanes launched the attack from. So basically that raises a lot of questions. If these were chemical weapons, then we're going to see actually probably support for the U.S. Position, for the French and the British. But there was also an attempt of Swedes offered to send an independent and help with an independent investigation. And yet it was the Western powers which said no. They defeated that suggestion. And so basically what we have heard so far, there are charges, there are accusations, they are repeated constantly. We don't have evidence. And we've heard this before with Iraq. We heard that there was, we know exactly where these weapons are, chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. And what did we find later on? That there was nothing. And yet, at that time, these were the justifications that were offered to mobilize American support. These were the justifications that were repeated time and time again in the American media and in some other media to justify the attack on Iraq. And we later knew that there was no nuclear weapons, no biological weapons. And if there were chemical weapons, they were very old and probably they could not be used anymore, and that's what was left. And in fact, there is the belief that if there were chemical weapons, if there were nuclear weapons, we probably would not have seen the war. The war would not have taken place. So that raises questions, actually, again. Now, there's no doubt that this is an important issue, this chemical issue, the use of chemical weapons, especially on civilians, and bringing the suffering to the people. That raises questions. But as you pointed out earlier, the people of Syria have been witnessing a great deal of suffering, not only from government forces, but from the opposition's forces. And also, we saw in Raqqa the attacks that took place. Raqqa was devastated. Thousands of people were died. Thousands of people died in Mosul, and yet we didn't hear anything about that. And that raises questions also about what kind of standards, the double standards that exist. So I think this is an important issue that should be raised, particularly at this time. And to go back to the question that you raised earlier, and that was very interesting, the change, although now, of course, the military has been ordered, or they have agreed to in accordance with the orders given by the president. But as of today, there were reports that while the National Security Council advisor and Mr. Pompeo were supporting the idea of using force, sending as a message to the Syrian regime, we also heard that the General Mattis and General Dumford were actually advising some caution, a cautious step, and trying to determine what really happened. And yet, well, now we see what has happened. It appears that the Hawks appear to have won at least the battle, this battle.
Guest here on the set is Edmund Ghareeb, and it's interesting she brought up Lakhdar Brahimi. He suggested that Syria may go the way of Somalia, a failed state. We saw in Lebanon, their civil war went on for 15 years. And you and I were talking about what this does for the war itself, that it perhaps prolongs it. Give me your sense, what does Syria look like at the end of all of this? And what should the international community be doing right now to try and bring about a peace?
This is part of the problem, a big problem, is that while Syria started as a civil war, in a sense, very quickly we saw it transformed into a proxy war. First, between some of the regional players, different players interfering in Syrian affairs. Money was sent, weapons were sent, people were being trained by some of the regional powers. And then we saw the superpowers becoming involved. France became Britain, the United States, Russia, Iran, Turkey was, of course, one of the regional powers was involved. Iran was also getting involved. And so the conflict in Syria became much more complex, much more complicated, much more bloody, unfortunately. And the conflict became over issues that had nothing to do or little to do with Syria. This was a struggle for influence, for power between all of these players, the regional players and the external, the foreign powers. And part of it, what we are seeing now, is this struggle between the United States and Russia, in a sense. There is a concern, and we saw this recently with the National Security Strategy document that was issued and just less than a couple of months ago, that Russia and China were seen and perceived as being competitors, hostile competitors, revisionist powers. And this basically is saying that there is a change in the world, the emergence of Russia, the re-emergence of Russia, the emergence of China as a powerful economic power in the world is challenging the existing world order that we saw after the Second World War, and particularly after the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that these powers are challenging Western norms, basically, of democracy, of capitalism, at least this is what we have been hearing of democracy. Mm-hmm. And this raised this issue of Syria to a new level. It no longer was a Syrian conflict or just a Syrian conflict. It became an international problem and a regional problem. And that complicated the lives of many Syrians. Syrians, unfortunately, are paying the price for this conflict and this competition.
The cradle of civilization under attack.